in your studying your Bible, predominantly in the Old Testament, you may have come across a word and just skimmed right over it. I know I did years ago. I would read the Bible almost every night, but I didn't know what it said. It didn't mean anything to me. But there's a word back there. I want you to turn to 2 Kings 23 that may help you understand a little bit about what's going on in the world today. If I told you that this word relates to the churches of today, you might be mystified and ask the question, well, how could that be? But it's amazing how we haven't changed that much. In thousands of years of history, how pretty much people today are doing the same thing. Witness the Christmas trees and the season to be jolly and all of that. But anyway, this doesn't contain exactly that. But in 2 Kings 23, I'll start reading verse 1. It says, and the king, now this is talking about Josiah. A little history on that. Josiah was appointed to king after some of the wicked rulers. And some of the wicked rulers had gone in and had adopted the ways of the heathens. They had brought in many of the customs that the heathens did, and God told them not to do that. But Josiah, the high priest, and cleaning up the temple, when Josiah came in, wanted to do what was right, but he had him to go in, he was cleaning up the temple, and the priest came to him and said, hey, I found this book. It was the book of the law. And he started reading it, and he just fell down on his knees and said, oh my God, thank you for revealing this to me. He said, we've got to do some stuff. They repented, and they started cleaning up the temple and so forth. And so that's where we are when we come to 2 Kings 23 and verse 1. It says, the king Josiah sinned, and they gathered unto him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. He's going to put the house in order. And the king went up into the house of the Lord, and all of the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, small and great. I mean, everybody was involved in this. And he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant. He read the law to them, which was found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood by a pillar. Now, superficially reading that, you may not realize what that understands, or what that means. But it actually, that's Jacob's pillar stone. And if you go back, I'm not going to turn back there, to 2 Kings 11, verse 14, you'll see that the kings were coronated over that pillar stone. And so it's talking about that pillar, that stone that Jeremiah took up, and it says now it's in England. I think it's in England or Scotland or wherever it's turned over, and it's located there today, but it's still there. And so the king stood by a pillar, and he made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies, his statutes, with all their heart and all their soul. So they repented, and they're going to turn to God. In verse 4, the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order. You know, there were certain orders that worked in the temple, and they'd come in, they'd serve their order, and then they'd go home, and then there were others that come in, and they had so many Levites that they couldn't all serve at the same time. And it said some of the duties, the keepers of the door, to bring forth out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal. So apparently the kings before them had brought certain items into the temple in the worshiping of Baal. And of course God looks upon that as an abomination. So he's cleaning house. And for all the host of heaven, they used to worship the sun, the moon, the stars, everything but to worship God. And he burned them without Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried the ashes of them unto Bethel. And he put down the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah. Now, I'll get to those high places in just a moment and tell you what those are all about. And in the places round about Jerusalem, them also that burned incense unto Baal. And here's what they worship: the sun, the moon, the planets, and to all the host of heaven. Now notice verse 6. This is what I'm talking to you about. And he brought out the grove from the house of the Lord without Jerusalem unto the brook Kidron, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and he stamped it to small powder. Well, what is that grove? Well, first thought you'd say, well, I know a grove is a clump of trees. But this was something that he picked up and he took out of that temple. And it was so abominable to him that they burned it up, and he stomped it, and it was become dust. So it speaks of the grove in a singular tense. It was something that he could pick up, and he hated it so vehemently that he burned it and ground it into bits. just exactly what was the true meaning of the word grove as defined in the original Hebrew in which the Old Testament was written. Well, the word there, in every instance that you see the word grove, except one, the Hebrew word is Asherah. A-S-H-E-R-A-H. But there's one situation that you find it, that it doesn't pertain to that. The one exception where grove doesn't mean Asherah is found in Genesis 21:33. And I'm not going to go back there, but you can look it up later. But it says here the Hebrew word is Eshel, E-S-H-E-L, and it simply means tree. In that land, Abraham planted a tree. But that had nothing to do with Asherah or the groves that we mentioned over in 2 Kings. There was no religious meaning attached to the tree. Beersheba is a hot, dry place, so the tree was made for shade. So that's the only place where the word grove is used that it doesn't mean Asherah. As you'll notice in the reading of various other scriptures mentioning these groves, they're always in connection with idols, images, pagan worship, and so forth. Let me give you one. Let's not go too far, so let's go back to 2 Kings 17. 2 Kings 17, and notice verse 16, just as an example. And it says, they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even 2 calves, and they made a grove, and worship all the host of heaven, and serve Baal. Now many times they would go out in these groves, and they'd shave the limbs off the trees, and there would be long poles sticking up, and that's where they did a lot of their ritualistic worship, out in the groves. But they had a grove. We were talking about the single sense. These groves, or Asherahs, were symbols of a pagan goddess called Astarte, or Easter, as we later come to know. Astarte was worshipped as the queen of heaven, and that's where they get the word Easter from. You know what Easter is, sunrise services, when they claim that that's when Christ arose. So all of the heathen nations worshipped her through these images. When Israel came into the land of these pagan peoples, they soon began inculcating these idolatrous practices into their religion also. Just exactly what God said don't do. He said, learn not the way of the heathen, but they went out and they wanted to know, what are y'all doing? And so they started picking it up. This was rank idolatry, which God condemned. That's why Josiah smashed the grove that he brought out of the temple, as we read in 2 Kings 23:6. He knew it was an abomination to God. Well, here's why it was an abomination. To honor Astarte, men and women practiced prostitution, and positive efforts were made to induce spiritual frenzy through wild dances and self-mutilization. That they tried to work up the spirit, like some Pentecostal people do today. They want to stir it up, and they get to prancing around and dancing and rolling in the floor, and some of them even get involved with snakes and handling like that. It's certainly not of God. Not only did the people bow down to the symbol of the queen of fertility, but they carried on a virtual orgy of demons before their images or Asherahs. It may surprise you to know that this satanic worship is carried on today, right in the midst of modern Israel, by millions of people. So I never saw them do that. Well, the key to understanding this fact is the identity of this pagan goddess Astarte, or Asherah. The groves were posts, pillars, images of stripped trees dedicated to the worship of this woman. In Hislop's The Two Babylons, on page 307, it says this queen is identified. The Semiramis, under the name of Astarte, was worshipped not only as an incarnation of the Spirit of God, but as a mother of mankind. Hence you see the mother and the child around Christmas time. Astarte being the mother, and of course her son, Tammuz, they worshipped him. So we have very clear and satisfactory evidence that this is Semiramis. She was deified as Astarte and worshipped as the sex queen of heaven, the goddess of fertility. So if you're reading back in Ezekiel, you see them talk about the queen of heaven. They bake cakes to the queen of heaven, and they worship Tammuz. That all relates to the Babylonian mystery religion. The Asherahs, or groves, were symbols of fertility used in pagan idolatrous worship of her, the goddess of fertility. She was, I guess that's why they call the Catholic Church the Great Whore, because she was the first. In order to get men and people into the church, they had prostitutes. And of course they used prostitution to bring in their converts. And of course they worshiped sex, the fertility. They It was just a symbol that they worshiped and went in for big time. They have been brought down through the generations since her reign until now by millions who have knowingly or ignorantly been duped into the despicable worship of her. And astounding as it may seem, you probably have many of these symbols or groves right in your hometown. You probably pass some on the way to services over here today, as you pass some of the churches. They've spread the world over and stand in mute dedication to the Queen of Heaven, the great whore Semiramis. They're simply obelisks. And if you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see the George Washington Monument, and it's that huge obelisk that is dedicated to George Washington. They're called upright towers, and they represent the male sex organ. In Semiramis' day, they were usually erected on a higher place. Now, I mentioned to you about high places. Well, they'd go up high so you could see them. You ever drive along across the country and you look over on the hillside and there's 3 crosses? Where do they put them? They put them up where everybody can see them, don't they? Up in the high places. Well, that's the way they did then. They put them in the high places. Let's go back to 1 Kings 14, verse 23. 1 Kings 14, 23. And let's notice what it says here. It says, for they also built them, these groves, on high places and images and groves on every high hill and under every green tree. So that's where they put them so that they could see them. They could go in there and worship. They were put at the place of worship. Today they are still used at the place of worship in the pagan churches of the world. In the form of what? Steeples. Steeples. Perched on top of the church buildings themselves. So we see we haven't changed too much from Semiramis' day, have we? Sometimes at the very peak of the steeple, you may see something else. You may see a cross, which is attached supposedly in commemoration of Christ's death on the cross. However, the truth is that this cross represents the male member also. The well-known T-shaped cross was in use in pagan lands long before Christianity as a representation of the male member. That's why, as I mentioned Tammuz, they worship Tammuz as the son of God. And that's why you see the Catholics today, when they go, they think it's a holy symbol, but they're making the sign of the T. And so they put that cross right on top of the steeple, which is another symbol of the male sex symbol, and it's carried on right down to today. So when they tell you to enter the church of your choice every week, believing you're worshiping God, when in fact they are merely sitting in a high place with an Asherah or grove poised over their heads as a symbol of the goddess of fertility. They worship, they know not what, but one day they're going to learn. Satan is a clever deceiver and a liar who has blinded the entire world. So the next time you're reading your Bible and you're studying, you go through back in the Old Testament, you come upon the word grove in your Bible, then hopefully we'll know exactly what it means.